My first thought is security in terms of people, so individual security as people and as citizens, whether that be climate security, food security, economic security, and that goes back to this whole systems theory of security, which I hope one day becomes a thing. And then also the security of being able to exist as who you are.
That's the voice of Anuradha Dimale, Policy Fellow at the British American Security Information Council. She and Dr. Alexi Drew, a senior analyst at RAND Europe, are today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast, dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dalton.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome back to Press the Button. Cherry blossoms are finally here in Washington, D.C., and the weather is warming up, so things definitely feel like they're looking up a bit. And Tom, you had quite the weekend. Congratulations on the New York Times piece.
Hey, Michelle, great to see you. Thank you very much. Yeah, anytime you get a piece in the New York Times, it's because you had a lot of help and a lot of luck. And I had both of those, so in spades. So thank you very much. I also happened to be in Kansas City for a wedding on top of all that. So it was quite a wild weekend, but a lot of fun at the wedding in Kansas City. Had the kids out there dancing on the dance floor, so it doesn't get any better than that. How was your weekend?
It was great. Lots of time outside. My partner and I grilled hot dogs for the first time this season, so I am ready for the warm weather. But this is all, of course, very happy news. What do you have for us on the nuclear front?
Well, the war in Ukraine kind of grinds on. The war may be reaching a stalemate as Russia suffers troop and equipment losses that continue to bog it down. But a stalemate, unfortunately, does not necessarily bring peace. It may mean that the war will get bloodier as Russia gets more desperate to make progress. The hope is that Russia will realize it has little chance of defeating Ukraine and that Moscow will then seek a political settlement. But we just don't know. This may get worse before it gets better. Some good news: after spending some 600 hours in the Russia-controlled Chernobyl nuclear plant, 64 workers were finally allowed to go home, a well-deserved break for them. Some good news on the Iran front. After delaying the talks, Russia has come back to the table, and the negotiations appear to be back on track. We'll tell more about that story next on Early Warning, where I talk with Sara Haghdoosti, Executive Director of Win Without War, and we'll go into the latest developments on Iran, so please stay tuned.
And in the meantime, we want to wish a happy Nowruz for those who are celebrating. We hope that this year brings peace and good wishes to everything you do. After that, I sit down with Dr. Alexi Drew, a senior analyst at RAND Europe, and Anuradha Dimale, a policy fellow at BASIC, to discuss what security means, how it affects those with intersectional identities, and what needs to change in our institutions and our field. March is Women's History Month, and next Thursday is International Transgender Visibility Day, so this is a very timely conversation.
And if you like what you hear, as always, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into the episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. After almost a year of talks, there is finally hope that the Iran nuclear deal may come together in the coming days. This comes after reports last week that Russia was holding the deal hostage to its demands related to the war in Ukraine. But now that Russia is apparently cooperating again, we may be near the finish line. To give us the latest, we are joined by Sara Haghdoosti, Executive Director at Win Without War. Sara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And before we get started, I just wanted to say Happy Nowruz and Happy New Year to all of your listeners who celebrate.
Thank you for that. We appreciate it. So hopes are increasing that we may be inching towards an Iran nuclear deal. Can you give us some insight into what happened and what is happening with Russia's position?
The good news is it appears that the speed bump from Russia is resolved and is no longer an issue. Obviously, over the last several weeks, the US and many other countries have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia for their invasion of Ukraine. Now, as part of the JCPOA, Russia has certain obligations, particularly in helping remove Iran's enriched uranium. The parties to the talks work to clarify that these new sanctions on Russia would not impede their ability to meet their obligations under the JCPOA. There was also a brief moment where Russia's foreign minister seemed to be suggesting they wanted larger sanctions relief as part of a renewed Iran deal, but thankfully that was quickly rejected and the demand was withdrawn. And the key once again here is principled diplomacy has resolved the issue, and now all that is left is to seal the deal.
Would it be that easy, right? Because it wasn't only Russia's concerns that were holding things up. There are still other key issues to be resolved. Give us a sense of what those are.
One of the other key issues that has been coming up throughout the negotiations is Iran has wanted some more certainty around the longevity of the deal and sanctions relief. And I think there's two things that are important to pull out here. One is people can often forget that the JCPOA is not simply a deal between Iran and the US. It is a multilateral deal between many different countries. And when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal, it not only led to the crisis we're in now, but also really harmed the US's reputation. Diplomacy works when everyone keeps their promises. And when the US didn't keep its promises, it hurt our reputation and is leading to some of these speed bumps now.
So how are organizations in the community like yours, Women Without War, preparing for a deal if we get one? And in particular, are you expecting a vote in Congress?
We think that a vote in Congress is likely if we get a deal. And one exciting thing that we've done over the last week with the National Iranian American Council is that we've mobilized people from around the country around this issue. And that's what we want to do more of if we see good news coming out over the next few days, hopefully. And here's the thing. While the Iran deal might be controversial in the halls of Congress, it's not at all controversial around kitchen tables across the country. People understand that we're not talking in abstracts about this issue. The deal worked before, and we've seen how quickly things have spiraled without it. Getting back into the JCPOA is good policy, good politics, and also just common sense. And that's why our key priority, if we get a deal, is to connect everyday people from around the country with decision makers so that they can make that point in their own words as many times as possible.
Great. Well, Sara, thank you so much for being here. We are out of time, but I want to wish you all the best in all your work going forward, and let's hope we get a deal soon.
Let's hope.
Hi, my name is Chase Sunright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
When we talk about security, international, national, or personal, we need to be clear about answering the question of security for whom. This month, we mark two major events, Women's History Month and International Transgender Day of Visibility. While we've seen progress in advancing civil rights and visibility for women and transgender folk, we have a long way to go to build a safe and secure society. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Alexi Drew and Anuradha Dimale to discuss what keeps us safe. Dr. Alexi Drew is a senior analyst at RAND Europe, where she works on defense, security, and infrastructure issues. Anuradha Dimale is a policy fellow at BASIC and future doctor. She is a PhD researcher on responsibility in outer space for the EU-funded Third Nuclear Age Project at the University of Leicester, and both are well-versed on issues of inclusion. So, first things first, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's great to be here.
Long-time listener, first-time joiner.
Both of you are experts in cybersecurity and more broadly, national and international security. When you hear the word security, what does that mean to you?
In my perspective, I do a lot of work in security from a defense perspective. So when we say cyber, we're talking literal infrastructure and the systems and the things that we use to, in many cases, carry out offensive or defensive cyber attacks or uses of military force. And although that's a lot of the work I do, it's the kind of bread and butter, particularly around. I didn't come to the field from that direction. I came to the field from the direction of much more human security concepts. So the idea of privacy, access to information, the potential democratizing power of like new forms of communication and the things that we can do with technologies. And I always enjoy more the opportunity to get back to those questions. Like, I grew up with the internet. Right? The internet was like a thing. I remember hearing the sound of the modem while lying on my parents' bed and trying to get my ridiculously large tower computer to connect to the internet at like 56K. And when I decided what to do with my doctorate, it was very much at the time this new formation of ideology of what can we do with this thing? Like Tim Berners-Lee and the whole let's connect people globally. Let's allow people to access information for free, to do whatever they want with it, learn from it, grow from it. And for me, that all comes down to the kind of this maybe idealist concept of equaling the playing field through this access to information, like leveling everything. And, for me now, 10, 15 years later, giving my age away a little bit, is that we potentially don't have that. We've strayed from what would seem to be a clear and obvious path towards what the internet and the services and other technologies can allow us to potentially achieve. And now I look at it and go, well, there's a lot more work to do to try and drag us back to that route. So for me, security now, like the kind that I want to do, is try and find a way to ensure that the things that we invent, the new technologies that we come and develop and throw out to the world, actually are designed in a manner that actually allows us to achieve that, to give everyone the opportunities these things are meant to and should have been always about, even though we've potentially gone off track somewhat. So that's me in a nutshell, really.
So, how to follow Alexi on this is a hard thing. But I come at this from several different angles. I come at this from the angle of someone that works in the international security space, as someone that came from a background in science policy and a more systems view of security, but also someone that's quite active in the advocacy and empowerment space for minorities. And I actually struggle with, personally, even defining what security means to me. If pre-pandemic, if you'd have asked me, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you say security, I would have thought, okay, international security. We're thinking your general broad, like nuclear weapons, how to keep people safe, how to keep countries safe. And so that definition of safety and security were always conflated in my mind. And when I think of it from a space perspective, security becomes an even more warped concept based on the ideals that we have in traditional arms control of what security means and what the units of security and securitization are. That all becomes blurry. And I love that blurriness. I love that blurriness because it makes for difficult questions, and difficult questions are the ones that almost always need to be answered. But when I look at it from sort of the advocacy space, sometimes I just feel like a lot of that is existential. Like a lot of this international security dialogue is existential from a nuclear weapons, all of this perspective. Hard to say that now, given, the current conflicts. My first thought is security in terms of people. So individual security as people and as citizens, whether that be climate security, food security, economic security. And that goes back to this whole systems theory of security, which I hope one day becomes a thing. And then also the security of being able to exist as who you are. As a person of color in this field and as a queer woman, it's constantly a reminder to me that I have to do certain things to assimilate and be safe and secure within this field. And so post-pandemic, especially, given how things were so all over the place, how, my relationships, my friends, their families and their sense of security were questioned. Security and its definitions have warped even more for me now.
I really appreciate how you all are thinking about the different modules or levels of security. And I think, what you're talking about, the question it really provokes for me is, can we reach a place where when we talk about individual security, it can encompass this notion that an individual's security doesn't come at the expense of somebody else's?
That question really does encompass this, particularly the division between, international security to human security. In the policy space around technologies, which is where I normally work, I often find myself asking a couple of questions connected to that. One of which is, does it matter why states or institutions do the good thing for the internal security? Does it matter that they're not doing it for the right reasons? Does it just matter as long as they're doing it? And I used to be really idealistic, thinking, no, I want them to do it for the right reasons, and that should then inform a long-term plan where we all do the right things and it spreads. And as I've become increasingly cynical, and I suppose I've found myself at the coalface for too long, banging my head against brick walls, I think maybe the first step is just recognizing that we can somehow achieve the right things for the wrong reason. And it's often about trying to demonstrate to different actors that have a different concept of security and different motivation of how to achieve that, is how that getting the one that's good for them can also achieve the thing that's good for another concept of security. And that can be really difficult to do, particularly when you come in it from a position of yourself, of being the unit of that insecurity. When you're the person like myself who, as a trans woman in the UK, goes, yeah, we really should have some level of privacy available to anyone on the internet. And yet I go into a policy space right now in the UK where we've just seen the online harms bill published again. It makes it really clear that the UK government's response to a vast array of insecurity forms, from human to international security encompassed in this bill, effectively is remove the means of encryption, increase the level of personal identity connection to what you do on the internet in digital forms. That solves the problem. And I'm there going, well, it solves the problem for 80% of the population, but it doesn't solve it for me. And not only does it not solve it for me personally, it doesn't solve it for me academically. So then to come to that and go, okay, I want you to do this for the right reason, but you're not going to do that pragmatically. So I need to find another way to go, actually, look, this isn't the right means of doing it. There's another way where you can get what you want, but you can also, as a kind of throwaway happy coincidence, also do good things, the individuals. And I think that can be a really hard thing to do for people that already exist within these categories, they're in minority groups, because it can often feel like, in a way, you're kind of giving in. You're not aiming for the best outcome. You're not aiming for the ideal. I find that quite hard at times, and you question, like, what's the point? Have I given in and gone for a half measure when I could have done? I should continue to aim for the whole way.
I agree about, why can't we see beyond the immediate outcomes of something to see how it benefits everyone? I think often we get talked down to or othered as self-label. For the longest time, I was like, I don't want to self-label as a minority in this space. I'm everyone. Like, I'm part of it. But actually, no, I will self-label as a minority in this space. And the reason for that is because it does disproportionately impact me. And, I'm still privileged. I'm a cis woman. I live in the UK, which, for all of its faults, I'm safe. I'm not in the middle of a physical conflict at the moment. But I still feel the discrepancies in existing in this field and in the international security space. And in the security space, I've gone on about this a lot, but discrimination in policing is something that we still see. Discrimination from those in power in general, whether that's implicit or explicit. And that is security, because it is to do with how secure you feel to exist. And I remember in one of my policy lectures, we were talking about how the ultimate aim of the government is the security of its citizens. Who decides that? Why does that decision lie with a small group of people who don't take into account the views of the people who they are trying to keep secure? And so I really think that, making noise, and I guess we'll come to a conversation about tone policing at some point in this, but making noise and making productive noise at different places. And obviously, yes, you need to know how to do it, but that's why, advocacy spaces exist. It's to train people and to teach them that even if they have the skills, to enable them and provide them with a platform and an engagement forum within which to use those skills to influence power. And so, yeah, that's kind of where my brain's at the moment with all of this.
I completely, I think that a lot of us, or we have a really interesting parallel. Like you mentioned that you kind of decided to own and kind of be the minority, and I actually use that, do good with that. When I first started at King's, my first postdoc 5 years ago now, it seems like an age. I at the time had literally, I was at the point in my transition where I'd gone from doing my PhD as outwardly a cis male, which had all sorts of other crap on top of it that normally I would bank and want not to have to deal with. I had to come to a conclusion or decision, like how was I going to professionally present myself, moving from doing education or being educated to doing professional work in security. And then not just security in terms of an academic sense, because the role I was going into had a really strong policy angle to it, and integration with defense and all of the baggage that comes with that. And not only just defense, but like nuclear defense, which is like the oldest school component of it. The very first event I went to after joining was NukeFest, Carnegie's like big conference in DC. I remember having to get a last minute passport change because on the fly I decided that I was going to be myself. And I had a week to go and get a new passport in my name, in my gender, and actually fly to the US. And there was no one I worked with who understood the complexities and difficulties of being a trans woman going through that kind of administrative burden, and then having to go through US TSA, which was an absolute nightmare. And then you go to Carnegie, and I'm just standing in the atrium, and all around me are people who have obviously, they fit a mold and a model. And there was no difference, there was no variation, there was no diversity. And I was there going, how is anyone going to do innovative thinking in this space that actually breaks out of the mold of security that we've been operating under for 60 odd years, when the only people thinking about these things and at this kind of, the pièce de résistance of this field are all the same? It's just madness. And I think that's when I decided that no, I was going to be open about who and what I am, because if I'm not, then no one else ever will be, and someone has to start it off. And I think, Anu, the fact that you do the same, and what you do with the other group of you that kind of are built around this space, we need that, and I'm thrilling to see it happening.
And I just wanted to add a caveat onto what I think Alexi will probably agree with me on this, is that we are very lucky that we are able to do this. Mm-hmm. I would never, ever expect anyone that is in a compromised position or minoritized position, the default should not be that they have to tip the scales for themselves, because they're not secure. They're not secure. Yep. I know that when I've protested in the UK, I have taken my passport out with me because I might need to prove that I'm a UK citizen. And when I've had to say that to my white friends, it's been met with, I'm sure it's not that bad. It is that bad. And I'm lucky that I've never had to go through that, but I know people that have. And so if we are able to create a platform of safety by fighting back a little bit because we have the capital behind us, then I think it becomes our duty to do that.
Yeah, 100%. I was really lucky that when I applied for my job at King's, I'd been applying for academic jobs for ages, and no luck, nothing. I had a PhD in cybersecurity, but I couldn't find a postdoc. And I applied for this job with Heather Williams when she was at CFFF, and I had nothing for a while. And then I decided, I looked at sources of inequality and the problems that might be holding me back, and realized that all of my academic work, all of my publications, every single bit of it was in my old name, including my PhD. So if you do a basic background check on the CV and application I submitted, you find nothing. So I thought, well, I've only got one choice to try and actually get employment, and that was effectively to out myself. And this is the only way I could do it. So I directly emailed Heather and went, look, if you're trying to find me, you won't. You need to look at this for this name. And that was, people shouldn't have to do that. And I was lucky enough to be able to feel comfortable enough to do that and be vilified in that, because Heather was fantastic and then took a punt on me and gave me a job. I mean, that's why I have the security now to be open about who I am. But if someone hadn't taken that chance and I hadn't felt comfortable and secure enough to do it, even in that small sense, yeah, it's not easy. And I don't think anyone should be forced to do that. But the nature and the systems of how early career research and academia and security, the field operates, forces people to make those really difficult decisions, which is ridiculous.
Thank you both for sharing your stories and the thought behind the decisions that you've made. And as you've mentioned the role of institutions, whether they are formal or more informal. The recurring Carnegie conference is, I would say, definitely an institution. And so I guess on that, shifting from policies to practice, I 100% agree in that, it shouldn't be on the individual to change the institution by themselves. So what does need to change about the institutions? Things that leaders can do, that boards of directors can do, that your coworkers can do, that would actually make them safer for their colleagues.
This might seem slightly tangential, but I promise that it's got a point. So in preparing for my PhD, I've been reading about this thing called the English School, a weird name for a theory. I don't come from an IR background, so I've been refreshing. And as a systems theorist, by hobby even, I was looking for something that would help me understand IR from a more sort of connected perspective. And in the English School, there are many things, but there's a definition of an institution. And an institution is not an organization. An organization is a secondary institution. And what it's dependent on is this other notion of an institution, which are the networks, which are the norms, which are the behaviors that connect us all. And secondary institutions, which are organizations, are reliant on these relationships, or primary institutions. And I really like that as a concept. What it doesn't mean is that organizations can just take the blame off themselves and be like, the field is like this, so we can't do anything about it. That's not what it means. What it means is that there's a two-way symbiotic relationship, in my view, between how we treat each other as a field, the way that we carry out our work, and how we exist as organizations. One thing that, if you've heard me speak before, something I say a lot is I am very done with any organization that treats diversity as an end goal. Diversity is not an end goal. Diversity is a process, diversification, if you will. Diversity is a process through which you are achieving equity. Equity is the goal, equity, which means that everyone is on the same level, which means some people need a bit of a boost because not everyone comes into the society that we've designed for ourselves at the same level. And equity does not have the same definition around the world. It varies based on where you are. It varies based on what organization you're in, what field you're in. But broadly speaking, accessibility is something that is so forgotten and is so interlinked to gender, right? So today we're here because we're talking specifically about gender, but you can't take away issues of accessibility and justice in general from gender. The amount of organized events I've been to that don't have spaces for people that may be breastfeeding or maybe are neurodivergent and need time out or are not wheelchair accessible is surreal to me. there are practical steps that we can be taking as organizations in order to actually make the space more inclusive. And these are some of them. And I think organizations or teams such as Orgs in Solidarity do a really good job of information sharing on that matter. But also there are people in the field that you can go to and pay for their expertise. Treating these issues as a tack-on is never the solution. If you're organizing an event, think about it from the beginning. Make sure every aspect of your event, from the speaker list, from the way that they're presenting and speaking, their slides, are they high contrast? Have you got breaks scheduled? If it's a virtual event, some women or gender minorities around the world might not be allowed to turn their cameras on. Are you imposing that on them? So taking these practical steps from language to practice, so language being using gender neutral language in your conference programming, for instance, or within your writing, to practice, which are some of the things I've outlined, are very small things that we can do to start influencing the institution within which we exist. And pushing the blame, it's just symptomatic of our field, is a cop-out. And I don't think that there's any excuse for doing that.
I would say that one of the key problems with institutions that Anu already touched on, but I think I can go into a little bit more depth, is that institutions are attempting to prove that they've reached this endpoint of diversity. It's not an endpoint anyway, it's a process. But I think that they're driven to demonstrate quantifiably and with a displayable and obvious metric that they've achieved it. And it's effectively just, it's not enough. It doesn't incentivize the process approach that Anna was talking about. It limits what you do and it limits how much you do. It's why we only see, I think, targeting a concept of diversity, which is about gender. We don't see it targeting race. We don't see it targeting disability. We don't see it targeting neurodivergence or gender identity, because those things are harder to quantify. They're qualitative and not quantitative, which means that you can't prove that you've achieved it. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why institutions struggle to actually do anything more than the surface level stuff. And I think the other problem is education and knowledge, that a lot of the institutions of all types don't have many people who are actually from a wide array of different types of diversity, which means that even of those who are and are then willing to talk about it and to help educate their peers and their colleagues, there's a very small number of those people. And it can be really draining. It means that you're always the one asked about, well, what should we be doing for people like you? And sometimes I'm in the mood to do that. Other times I'm not in the mood to do that. But I do it once, and suddenly everyone assumes I'm always up for explaining how to be trans-friendly in an event or something that they're running. But I'm not. Some days it's just been too much, and I can't deal with that. But the problem that comes from that is that institutions simply don't consider different types of diversity, and when they do, they have no real obvious means of going to a source to get information about that. And it's why, when working at King's, I got requests to go and work in Kazakhstan or Saudi Arabia, going, oh, this sounds like a great course. It pays some extra money, go and do some teaching, and did on the CV. By the way, it's in a country where your identity is illegal. That bit wasn't obviously in the content because they never even knew to ask it. And it's not done through ill will, it's simply, or malintent. It's simply because they don't know that they should be considering that. If it was gender, perhaps they would go, we probably shouldn't send a female presenting or a cis female to Saudi Arabia. And if we do, we should tell them about the limitations and give them the option to decide whether they go ahead with it or not. But no one thinks about, well, should we send a trans woman to Saudi Arabia or Iran or somewhere like that? They just do it. Russia, for example, there is no way I would go to an event in Russia, even before what's going on in Ukraine. And yet, a lot of nuclear work is done in Russia. And I would have been expected to go. And no one would have asked. And that, I think, is the kind of dynamic that this lack of education, coupled with the quantification, creates in terms of problems of diversity in our field.
And I just want to also draw attention to, and Alexi, you mentioned this before, all of these institutional level contexts come as well in the broader context of a wave of anti-transgender legislation. So, according to Human Rights Campaign, 2021 was the worst year for LGBTQ state legislative attacks here in the United States, with more than 250 anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced in state legislators. And I'm aware that there's been a similar wave in Britain as well. So this is a whole nother conversation that we can go into, but I just want to call attention to the fact that you're not just talking about the context in which people work, you're also talking about the broader societal context in what their experience is just living their lives. Knowing that we are running up against our time limit, I want to end on a slightly different note. What part of your work is giving you inspiration right now?
Personally, for me, actually, RAND has a very directed way of working. I get to work on projects that government or funders are interested in. So I don't get to develop much of my own work. But what I actually find most rewarding recently is being able to do things like this, honestly. Like, I made the decision to be open about who I am for a reason. A lot of it was driven by the fact that I wanted to be able to demonstrate that although there are lots of things that hold people like me back from working in this field, they don't have to. And there is a way to get through that. And I think by doing things like this, and by doing outreach and by mentoring people of all sorts of backgrounds, this is what I find most rewarding, because, you know, it hopefully means that I won't be the only person that I can point to in a room like me in our field in the next 5 years. And that's my thing.
For me, firstly, I want to give a shout out to Alexi just in general, because not only is she an amazing friend, but also she has been there for more people than I can count on my hands in terms of empowering them and supporting them and helping them progress, including myself. So thank you, Alexi, for that. Secondly, I'm just going to be a bit more shameless. So I work at Basic now, and part of my job, so I get to do a lot of cool things, but I'm going to highlight two of them. One part of my job is getting to actually work on empowering people from around the world that work on, security issues to actually have a say and influence the things that go into high-level fora. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is focusing on the Asia Pacific region and holding an event on the 30th of March at 4 p.m. Korean Standard Time, because we want to prioritize the participation from the region. But basically, it's going to be looking at, what are their concerns and how can we use that to reform the dialogue we have as a global nuclear policy community. And, we'll be continuing to doing work on that. And then on the other side, I get to do space stuff now, which is great. I was doing it already in my own time, although it didn't feel like it at times. But yeah, now I get to do it as part of this partnership with Leicester. And we're actually hosting a roundtable panel discussion in April on the upcoming open-ended working group on reducing space threats. And we're going to have an amazing group of experts there discussing, what we want to come out of it and how current conflicts, not just the one in Russia and Ukraine, but in the Middle East that are also happening and also are very important, will influence that dialogue. So those are two things that I'm really looking forward to. And I'm really proud of the people that I work with in this field.
You should be, because they're all awesome. And you're also awesome. I'll add one thing that I've done relatively recently that actually is in my field that I really enjoyed. Because it was my first trip out of the UK since lockdown started. So I guess actually one of the coolest things I think I've done recently was a trip to Geneva for a conference run by Unideer, which was done on deepfakes and kind of the technology itself, but also the implications for international security was the pitch, but it was also purposely driven towards broader concept security. So I got to sit on one of 3 panel events around explaining the technology, explaining its implications of the technology and the future mitigations potentially of the technology. And it was all about framing it in a manner that was accessible to diplomats and policymakers. And that was pretty cool.
Alexi, Anu, I just can't thank you enough for joining. That was really an incredible conversation. And just really appreciate both of your work and your willingness to share.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure, Michelle. Thank you for having us on.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.